Hey tea heads, this is Don from Mayleaf. In this video, what is Hui Gan? If you've watched my previous videos, you have no doubt heard me describe tea with the term Hui Gan, which generally means a certain type of sweetness. And if you are a tea lover and are particularly interested in raw pu'er, then you have no doubt read people describing the gun or the sweetness of a tea. But what is Hui Gan and how does it differ from tian, which is another word for sweetness? This video is the first in a two-part series. In this video, I'm going to be describing the sensation of Hui Gan. In the second video, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the potential science of all sweetness in tea, and specifically focusing on what causes Hui Gan in tea. Let's try to go back to the origin of Hui Gan. And I want you to imagine that you are in ancient China 3,000–4,000 years ago. We know that China has a long history of exploring herbs, the taste and the medicinal effect of herbs, which has formed the basis of Chinese medicine. And remember that tea is a Chinese herb and forms part of the Chinese medical herbal arsenal. So you imagine in China the people tasting and experimenting with lots of herbs. Now, in order to talk about Hui Gan, we first need to talk about bitterness. And bitterness takes three different forms. The first form of bitterness is a persistent bitterness. So when you have that bitterness which just stays on your tongue, a good way of explaining this type of bitterness is the bitterness that comes from, say, aspirin, or that pharmaceutical bitterness that persists on the tongue and it just stays there for a long time. The second type of bitterness is a bitterness that transforms, but it transforms to a dryness, to a puckering physical nature, to that drying, tightening sensation. The third type of bitterness is the type of bitterness which is most desired in tea and most desired in a lot of herbs, which is a bitterness which transforms to sweetness on the tongue. So it's a returning sweetness. It's a transformation. It's the end point of a journey. So you get bitterness that transforms to sweetness. Now, a lot of herbs will have a sort of combination of these three types of bitterness, and that is true also for tea. It's useful to look at the ancient Chinese characters for these words. Because the Chinese language is pictorial, it's useful to get a deeper sense of the meaning behind these characters. So here are the characters for Hui and Gan. Hui means returning to the original place, a returning. And so you can see the characters as sort of, the ancient character is a spiral going inwards, or the more modern character is two vaguely rectangular shapes, so returning to the middle, returning to the original place. So Hui means returning. Gan, on the other hand, is a pictorial representation of the tongue. And you can see a position on the tongue where the sensation of gan is felt. And the general translation for gan is sweetness, but it has more meaning than that. It has a deeper meaning than that. It can also be used to describe a sense of sweetness or a sense of joy or a sense of beauty. In fact, gan can be combined with other characters. For example, gan lin means sweet rain, but it doesn't mean the taste of rain. It means that the rain is coming at exactly the right time. When the rain is needed and it pours down at that right time, it's called gan lin. It's that sweet rain. It's that joyful rain that is coming at the right time. So gan is not just sweetness in terms of taste. It's a sense of sweetness or a sense of joy that comes as the result of a journey, the result of a transformation. And you can see in the ancient character for gan this returning of this sweetness and this beautiful sensation on the middle of the tongue. So Hui Gan means returning to the original place, this sense of sweetness and sense of joy. And I can imagine tasting these herbs that you get. A lot of herbs, for example, ginseng, a very powerful Chinese herb, licorice, a very powerful Chinese herb, and this herb here, KUDING, another very powerful medicinal herb. I'll put a link so you can see some of the medicinal effects of KUDING in the description below. But all of these herbs have a particular characteristic, which is that they start off bitter and then they return back at the end of that transformation to a sense of sweetness, a sense of persistent sweetness in the aftertaste. Now let's compare that to the other Chinese character for sweetness, which is tian. So let's take a look at the modern character for tian, and you can see on the right hand side you've got incorporated within the character the original character for gan, so that descriptor of sweetness or joy. But on the left hand side you've got another character, and that character in itself means tongue, so specifically means tongue. So it's a little bit confusing, but you're getting in tian, you're getting the combination of tongue and then the sweetness on the tongue. So you're getting this very direct descriptor of taste, a sweet taste. It's very much more of a sort of simple, direct taste of sweetness, whereas gan by itself is a little bit more poetic. It means a sense of sweetness. It means a sense of sweetness that comes as an aftertaste. It's a sense of sweetness that comes at the end of a journey or at the end of a transformation. And when you combine that with the character for hui, which again means returning to the original place, you can imagine that the bitterness then transforms and sweetness returns to that original place. And so you're starting to get a deeper sense of the meaning of Hui Gan. And as I said, Hui Gan does not just restrict itself to tea. In fact, a lot of Chinese herbs and a lot of medicinal herbs in general have Hui Gan, this transformation of bitter to sweetness. Now we're going to be talking about the science behind Hui Gan in the second video, but it certainly is a case that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, because plants have an ability when they are slightly bitter, and bitter represents generally that the plant has compounds that are going to have a pharmacological effect, toxic or medicinal, and oftentimes that depends on dose, right? But it's going to have a pharmacological effect. Bitterness has that instinctive, when we taste bitterness, we know that there's something powerful about it, which is why babies and children tend to stay away from bitter things, because you need to get to know which plants are medicinal versus toxic, and what you need to do in terms of figuring out your dose to make sure that you're getting the right pharmacological effect. So when a plant is bitter moving to sweet, there's a sensation that the plant is medicinal, and it might be encouraging us to drink it because it's paired with a little bit of that returning sweetness. Now what I have here is KUDING. KUDING, also known as big leaf KUDING or bitter nail tea. This is a powerful, powerful tea. You'll see that I'm not putting a lot of leaf in there, because anybody who's had KUDING tea before, this type of KUDING tea before, will know how potent the bitterness is of this tea, but it has very, very particular returning sweetness, and therefore I would say that bitter leaf tea has got very strong Hui Gan. So I'm going to be using this tisane to help to define the sensorial aspects of Hui Gan. I'm brewing the temperature up to 100 degrees so that I get a full extraction. I'm going to brew it relatively strong. Oof. Anybody who's had bitter nail tea or big leaf KUDING will know what I'm about to experience. It is potent, and I mean, think about it. Think of other Chinese herbs. Think of ginseng. Think of licorice. Think of KUDING. Think of huangqi or astragalus. All of these herbs, very potent medicinal herbs, all have the same characteristic, which is bitter to sweet transformation. And tea is, as I said, the first Chinese medicine herb. All of you tea lovers, you're actually drinking Chinese medicine. It is the first Chinese herb, and it has this enduring attraction to it, which is that bitter to sweet transformation. So as I said, tian is a descriptor of direct, simple sweetness, something from refined sugar, from honey, and potentially from fruits. And tian is a more modern character because ancient Chinese didn't have access to sugar. They probably had access to fruits, and honeys to a limited degree, but not to that sort of refined sugar sweetness. And tian is a combination of that tongue and sweetness, so direct sweet taste. Whereas gan, you can imagine all of these people who were tasting these Chinese herbs and they were getting this bitter sense. And then some of these herbs had that, oh, wow, there's this pleasant, joyful, lovely, sweet sensation which persists on the tongue afterwards. That was termed gan. Okay, I think that that's enough. You can see that this leaf is just not opening, but it's still extracting enough. You can take a look at the color of this. I'll smell this leaf. It has a very pungent, slightly smoky smell to it. Really, really deep, herbal, very much like deep forest herbal notes to it. Cheers, everybody. Here we go. So yeah, an intense, medicinal, aspirin, pharmaceutical style bitterness. Now it's lifting, now it's easing. And now I'm getting Hui Gan. I'm getting the return to the original place of bitterness in pretty much that place that describes gan pictorially, middle, slightly to middle to the back of the tongue. It has become sweet. And that sweetness is not direct. It's not a direct taste of sweetness, it's an aftertaste of sweetness. And this is why I'm always talking about aftertaste in tea, because aftertaste is one of the key definers of quality of tea. Because if you find in tea a bitterness that's persisting, or a bitterness which just transforms to astringency, then in general you are probably tasting lower quality, and in the case of raw pu'er, younger plantation tea. So how would we define Hui Gan if we were trying to describe the sense of Hui Gan? Well, first of all, I think that Hui Gan has to be the result of a transformation. It has to be the end of a journey rather than the start of one. Usually it's a transformation from bitterness, but sometimes you can get this returning sweetness that comes from very little bitterness, but it's just, it builds and builds and returns over time. So that's the first thing. It has to be the result of a transformation. And the second thing is it needs to be therefore an aftertaste. It's not something which is direct. It's not a direct tian sweetness, it's a gan, it's a returning sweetness, it's an aftertaste, it's something that persists in the mouth. Also, I would say it's true that this more herbal gan sweetness has a slightly cooling sensation. So if you breathe in and out, especially through your mouth, you'll notice that it has more of a cooling sensation to it. So gan needs to have that sort of slightly menthol cooling note. The next thing is it needs to be persistent. So it's one thing for it to be an aftertaste, but good Hui Gan stays with you. And this is why we love drinking teas with rich in Hui Gan, because of the fact that we know that minutes or hours after drinking the last cup, we are still going to have this persistent sweetness. And one of the ways that you can test whether or not you have got Hui Gan or this sweetness in your mouth, because sometimes as you go through a session, you can start to get used to a sense of sweetness in your mouth and you start to sort of forget about it. One of the ways is to simply drink water. So if you just take some water, which should be relatively neutral, and when you drink that water, if that water, ooh, that's hot. If you drink that water and it has a much sweeter taste, then that means that there's a lot of Hui Gan in the tea or tisane that you're drinking. Let's give this a taste. So it just tastes like it's been sweetened with sugar. And that shows you that there's a persistence of sweetness, which is very different from tian. When you eat something sugary, like you have, I don't know, just straight up sugar or some fruits, yes, there'll be some lingering sweetness, but it pretty much ends. You get a direct initial taste and then it's over. With gan, with that returning sweetness, it maintains, it persists in the mouth so that even plain water tastes sweet. And I would say that it might be getting a little bit, fluffy, but just indulge me on this, okay? I do think that the deeper sense, the deeper meaning of gan, so not just the physical sweetness, but this joy, like with gan lin, the sweetness of the rain, the fact that the rain coming at exactly the right time is this sweet, joyful experience. I do think that Hui Gan represents the same thing with tea drinking. It's leaving you with this sense of joy, this sense of sweetness, this sense of comfort. Yes, it's sweet in the mouth and it's cooling, and it's just giving you a nice, persistent sense of the joy at the end of the journey, the joy at the end of the tea session that persists with you for many, many hours. So I would describe Hui Gan as a sweetness that comes from a transformation, usually from bitterness. I would say that Hui Gan is an aftertaste rather than a taste. I think that a characteristic of Hui Gan is that it has a cooling sensation, almost like opening your sort of respiration sort of feeling. I think another characteristic of Hui Gan is its persistence. Try drinking water after a few sessions of a good tea with that Hui Gan. And finally, perhaps a little bit poetically, but I think that Hui Gan is also characterized by a sense of sweet joy that comes from this long, persistent sensation after your tea session. Right, that's my definition of Hui Gan. I'm very happy to hear your definition of Hui Gan in the comments section below. Stay tuned for part 2 of this video, where we are going to deep dive into the science of sweetness in tea, particularly Hui Gan, and we'll figure out more about the pharmacological action that may be related to Hui Gan. That's it, tea heads. Check out our other videos, taste our teas wherever you are in the world by browsing mayleaf.com, and come visit us if you're ever in London. Other than that, I'm Don from Mayleaf. Thank you for being a part of the revelation of true tea. Stay away from those tea bags, keep drinking the good stuff, and spread the word, because nobody deserves bad tea. Bye.